Alright, so here we are. We're going to do a quick example of how to modify pivots inside of Maya to show up properly in Unity. I'm going to bring in a sphere first, and we'll notice that the pivot is at the proper location at the center of the object. So the first thing we're going to do is hold down the D key and then the X key, and we're actually going to move that pivot somewhere else. Now that's what you want to do in case you'd like to move the pivot to a physically different location. However, that's not the case for rotations of the pivot. So, mostly what you'll probably try to do is go to rotation mode for that pivot, hold down the D key again, see this rotation gizmo, and attempt to rotate it. And at first glance, you see the gizmo rotating along with it. However, that's not correct. Anytime you do something like this and go back to that object, you're going to notice that your rotation axes actually pop back to where they were before. And we can validate this by going into the tool settings, making sure that we're on object mode, and we are. Therefore, whenever we click on this object, we should actually be seeing its object coordinate system. And as you can see, it snaps right back to where it was before. Now, what we're going to actually want to do in order to manipulate or rotate the local rotation axis is actually see the local rotation axis, which we can't yet. So what we're going to do is actually go to Display, Transform, and Local Rotation Axis is what we want to select. As soon as we do that, we're now going to have the ability to see that local rotation axis in space, and you'll notice that it's translated to the proper location. However, its rotation is still exactly the way it was before. So, in order to do this, to manipulate this object, we need to go into component mode by hitting F8, and then we want to make sure that we mask our selections up at the top. Once we've masked our selections, and the easiest way to do this is to turn them all off, we have this question mark. If we click the question mark and then right click it, you'll notice we have a few different options. One of them is for being able to select local rotation axes. If we make sure that's selected, now we'll be able to grab that local rotation axis and begin rotating it as if it was an object in the scene. So as you can see here, we're able to easily manipulate that local rotation axis. Now if we go back to that object and click on the Move Settings tool, what we're actually going to see is that the axis is in the correct place, it's off to the side. However, the interesting thing is that the object still looks like it's pointing in the wrong direction. What we actually need to do to make this work is we're going to need to freeze the transform of this object, but specifically we want to just freeze the we just want to freeze the translate and scale portions. We do not want to freeze the rotate portion. That is actually going to freeze the axis to be back in line with world coordinates. Immediately, what you should notice upon using freeze transforms is that your local transform gizmo basically is now both at the same position and orientation as your local rotation axes, and that immediately tells you you were successful. This process is what we use for pretty much any object where we need to manipulate the pivot and the pivot orientation inside of Unity. For each of the dinosaur bones we have, we're going to grab each one, show its local transform axes, and then manipulate them, rotate them to the right location. Once finished, we will, of course, grab our objects and use the File Send to Unity button, which does not have any restrictions at the moment for exporting polygons in excess of 100,000 faces. There we are. First thing I'm going to do is turn off X-ray for the moment. I'm going to get rid of the back by hitting Control H and hiding it. And then let's take a look at what we have so far. So as I mentioned, I'd actually done a little bit of testing by moving the pivots already. You'll notice that the bones already have their pivots displayed. Now, some of these bones are in the improper location. Upon testing with students, I found out that the pivots really need to be not in the centers of these bodies, but instead where you expect the skull to lock into and snap into the rest of the skeleton. So if we go ahead and hide some of these other parts really quick, for the skull, in this case, having the pivot right there in the center is just absolutely not intuitive. So to move this one, I'm going to hit the W key, and I'm actually just going to snap this pivot to the back side. And I'm guessing, hold down D and V and snap right about there is probably a perfect location to have that. That's about where I would expect a student to try to stick that head. I'm going to hit Control Save. I'm going to go to Edit, Modify, and Freeze Transform, and I'm just going to freeze the scale and the translate on that object right there. Perfect. So now I've got a pivot right there at the base that I want to manipulate with. In the case of the bone, what I want is for this object to actually be up here. That is in the socket where it snaps. So let's go ahead and hit D, hit the W key to go to translate, and hold D and V, and then left mouse click right there in the center to align it to the proper location. Perfect. I'm going to go ahead and hit save. I'm going to go to modify and freeze transform on that as well. The jaw on this side, frame up. Take a look. So we can see the jaw is somewhere in the center, not exactly intuitive placement for where you'd expect it to be. So I'm going to go ahead and move that up. Let's say I'm just going to hold the D key down and make sure that I'm kind of on. And I'm going to use the yellow box to move that up there to where I would expect that to be. Perfect. And that's pretty much it. So most of the other bones are roughly in the right spots. I'll go through and clean up the other skeleton elements, such as the other side of the arm. But that's really all that was necessary to get these pivots in the right place. Just make sure, once again, that you freeze your transforms and you edit, delete all by history before you bring things out in Unity. So the next step would simply be for me to go to File, Send to Unity, and in this case I'm selecting all, and save out my file. Once again, make sure you use the File Send to Unity function, as the export selection with FBX has a limit on the maximum number of polys you can push out of the system. Here we are inside of Unity. We're in an existing project. However, because I exported my FBX asset directly into the assets folder, or subfolder actually, into T-Rex Skeleton FBX, which you can see over here, I can go ahead and bring this right into my scene. Now, the first problem we're going to run into is the fact that the scale is going to be completely off. In my case, I have a scale factor of 10 that I need to apply to my models. Go ahead and hit apply right there. Give it a few moments to iterate through all of the mesh data and update it accordingly. There we are. So now we can go ahead and frame up on this. And what we should be able to do now is, well, let's zero out our transforms as well. We can begin to take a look at what's going on. Now, we want to make sure that our pivot is set to the pivot point, or our axis location is not only the pivot, but we want it to be local. Because if it's global, we're always going to have things pointing down the z-axis. But most importantly, we want to take a look, zoom in, and see that our pivots are indeed where we place them, and our axis orientation is correct. And as you can see here, that's where I moved it between the jaw, and that's how I aligned those particular elements. And you just want to go through and make sure that's correct. Uh-oh, we do have an issue here. So it looks like the back head has its axis flipped. The Z is pointing off and up, and the Y is pointing out, so that'll have to be adjusted back in Maya. And the jaw, though, looks proper. So I'll go back now in Maya and fix that up. And that's pretty much it for bringing in these objects and making sure the pivots are in the right location. Just making sure that you're truly moving the pivot of the object, freezing things, deleting history, bringing it into Unity, and then just making sure those axes are actually in the proper direction.